The doorbell rang at 6:50 on a Thursday evening, right in the middle of helping Maddie color a picture of a unicorn, and I want to tell you that nothing about that sound felt different from any other doorbell ring in the 9 years I'd lived in that house. My name is Ben, and I'm 38 years old, and I had what I genuinely believed, right up until that moment, was a happy marriage, the kind other people in our friend group referred to, half-jokingly, half-enviously, as the stable one. Natalie and I were the couple other couples asked for relationship advice. We were the ones who still held hands at other people's weddings. I opened the door expecting a neighbor, or maybe a delivery I'd forgotten about, and found a woman I didn't recognize standing on our porch in the fading evening light, holding her car keys in one hand with a tightness that seemed disproportionate to whatever errand had brought her there. She was maybe 39, dressed like she'd come straight from somewhere formal, and there was something in her expression, composed, but only just, like a held breath about to give out, that made the back of my neck go cold before she'd said a single word. "Are you Ben Calloway?" she asked. "Yeah," I said, already feeling something shift, the particular unease of a stranger who knows your full name and clearly knows something else too. "I'm Diane Pruitt," she said. "Greg's wife." I knew Greg. Of course I knew Greg. He played second base on the same recreational softball team I'd been on for 3 seasons, a genuinely funny guy, the kind of teammate who brought a cooler of good beer to every game and remembered everyone's kids' names. I'd met Diane exactly twice, both times at team barbecues, brief, forgettable exchanges about nothing in particular. I had absolutely no frame of reference for why Greg Pruitt's wife would be standing on my porch on a Thursday evening with that particular look on her face. "Diane, hey," I said, genuinely confused, glancing back toward the living room where Maddie was still coloring, oblivious. "Is everything okay? Is Greg all right?" "Greg's fine," she said, and something in the flatness of how she said it told me, even before the next sentence, that "fine" wasn't actually the relevant question here. "Is your wife home?" "She's upstairs," I said. "Why, what's?" "I need to talk to both of you," Diane said. "Together, if possible. I'm sorry to do this at your door, but I didn't think there was a version of this conversation that didn't have to happen in person." I stood there for a moment, my hand still on the doorframe, feeling the particular vertigo of a man who senses, before he has a single fact to support it, that the next 10 minutes of his life are going to be entirely different from the previous 9 years of it. I called up the stairs for Natalie, told her someone was here to see us both, and I want you to know that even in that moment, even with every instinct in my body telling me something was deeply wrong, I still had no actual guess as to what was coming. I am, by nature, a trusting man, and I'd never once had a reason to direct that trust anywhere except toward my marriage, my wife, my life exactly as I understood it to be. Natalie came down the stairs in sweatpants, hair pulled back, completely ordinary, completely herself, and then she saw Diane standing in our doorway, and something happened to her face that I would spend months afterward replaying, trying to fully understand. It wasn't confusion. It wasn't the polite, blank curiosity I felt myself. It was recognition, fast and total, gone almost as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a composure that arrived just a half-second too late to have been the natural first reaction. "Diane," Natalie said, and her voice came out steady, but something underneath the steadiness had already started, quietly, to crack. "I need to back up, because I want you to understand exactly how blindsided I actually was standing in that doorway, and the only way to do that is to walk you through the year that preceded it, a year I genuinely believed, almost without reservation, was a good one for Natalie and me. We'd been married 9 years, living in a comfortable house on a quiet street in Omaha, raising 2 kids, Cole, 8, who just discovered an obsession with magic tricks that involved him disappearing coins around the house with alarming regularity, and Maddie, still young enough to believe, completely, that her parents were the center of the universe. I worked as an athletic director at a local high school, a job that kept me busy with games and schedules but rarely demanded the kind of late-night, high-stress hours that eat away at a marriage. Natalie worked as a real estate agent, successful in the specific, demanding way that profession requires, evening showings, weekend open houses, a schedule that fluctuated week to week depending on the market and her client load. I want to be honest with you, looking back now, knowing what I eventually learned, I can identify things that, in hindsight, formed a pattern. But I need to be equally honest that almost none of them registered to me, in real time, as anything other than the ordinary texture of a busy, successful working mother's life. That distinction matters, because this isn't a story where I missed obvious signs out of denial. This is a story where the signs were genuinely subtle enough, and my trust genuinely deep enough, that I simply never went looking for a pattern at all. Natalie had started showing houses more frequently on weekend evenings that past spring, which I'd attributed entirely to the market. Omaha's housing inventory had tightened that year, competition for listings had gotten fierce, and every agent I'd ever heard her talk about was working longer hours to keep up. She came home some nights energized in a way I genuinely enjoyed seeing, talking enthusiastically about a property she'd just closed or a difficult negotiation she'd navigated successfully. I'd always loved that about her, her competence, her drive, the specific confidence she carried in a career she'd built from nothing over a decade. Greg and Diane Pruitt had become part of our broader social circle through the softball league about a year and a half earlier, and our two families had crossed paths regularly at team functions, barbecues, end-of-season parties, the occasional couples dinner when the softball wives group decided to organize something. I genuinely liked Greg. I considered him, in the easy, low-stakes way men consider teammates, a friend. I had no particular reason to think about him outside the context of Tuesday night games and the occasional beer afterward. Natalie mentioned Greg occasionally, in passing, the way you mention anyone in your broader social circle. Greg and Diane are doing that lake house thing again this summer, or ran into Greg at the gym, he's looking good, guess he's been training for something. I never thought twice about any of it. I want to underline that, because I think it's important for understanding how completely this caught me off guard. There was no moment, across the entire preceding year, where my gut told me something was wrong. Not one. I trusted my marriage so completely that I never developed even the low-level background vigilance that I now understand many spouses carry without realizing it. There were, I would later understand, small things happening that I simply never connected to anything, because I had no reason to be looking for connections in the first place. Natalie had started going to a particular gym on the north side of town, farther from our house than the one closer by, which she explained as having better childcare hours, a reasonable explanation I never questioned. She'd picked up a new habit of taking calls in the car in the driveway before coming inside after work, which I'd noticed and attributed to closing out client calls in privacy before walking into the chaos of dinner and homework. Her phone, which had always sat openly on the kitchen counter, started living in her purse more consistently, a shift I genuinely didn't register as significant, because nothing about our daily rhythm had given me any reason to be cataloging where her phone lived. Cole, at one point that winter, had mentioned, completely without weight, that Mom was at Mr. Pruitt's open house again, in the context of some unrelated conversation about a different topic entirely, and I'd nodded along, assuming it was simply professional overlap, real estate agents and their broader networks crossing paths constantly, nothing remarkable about it. I want to be fully honest with you, I am not telling you this part of the story to set up some dramatic reveal where I claim I should have seen it coming. I genuinely didn't see it coming, and I think the honest, uncomfortable truth is that a marriage built on real trust doesn't naturally generate the kind of vigilance that catches every small inconsistency. I wasn't ignoring red flags. I simply wasn't looking for any, because nothing in the texture of our life together had ever given me a reason to start. I want to tell you that there was a slow unraveling, a gradual dawning suspicion building across months, but the honest truth is that there wasn't, not for me. The suspicion, when it finally arrived all at once, fully formed, the instant Diane Pruitt said her own name on my front porch. What I can tell you, instead, is what I learned, in the hours and days that followed, about a parallel unraveling that had been happening entirely outside my awareness, Diane's own slow accumulation of suspicion over the preceding several months, which she explained to us both, sitting in our living room that same evening, with a precision that suggested she'd rehearsed this conversation many times in her own head before ever knocking on our door. I started noticing things back in the fall, she told us, sitting stiffly on the edge of our couch, her composure remarkable given what she was about to do to two households simultaneously. Greg started taking calls outside, in the garage, with the door shut. He'd never done that before. He started helping with paperwork for listings that, when I actually looked into it, weren't even his clients, they were yours, Natalie. She said this last part directly to my wife, who sat across from her, very still, her hands folded in her lap in a way that struck me, even in my own state of shock, as unnaturally composed for what was unfolding. Diane had found, she explained, a series of text messages on a shared family tablet that Greg had forgotten was still logged into one of his accounts, nothing explicit, but enough dates and meeting times that didn't correspond to any work commitments she could verify. She'd started, quietly, her own version of an investigation, pulling credit card statements, noting patterns in Greg's schedule, watching for the same kind of behavioral inconsistencies I'd simply never had cause to watch for in my own marriage. I found a hotel charge in January, she said. At the Marriott on 84th Street. I called and confirmed the reservation was under Greg's name. One night, during a week he told me he was at a conference in Lincoln. She paused, and for the first time, something in her controlled exterior flickered, not toward tears, but toward something colder, harder. I've known for about 6 weeks. I spent those 6 weeks deciding what I wanted to do about it, and I decided I wasn't going to let either of you keep living inside something I already knew the truth of. I sat there, absorbing all of this, feeling the specific, disorienting vertigo of learning, secondhand, through a stranger's careful investigation, an entire hidden year of my own marriage that I'd had no access to whatsoever. Diane hadn't come to our door out of anger alone, I realized, listening to her. She'd come because she'd already done her own grieving, in private, over 6 methodical weeks, and had arrived at a decision that the only way forward was full transparency, delivered all at once, to everyone affected. How long? I finally managed to ask, looking at Natalie, my voice barely steady. How long has this been going on? Natalie's face, throughout Diane's entire account, had been doing something careful and controlled, not the open collapse I might have expected, but something closer to rapid recalculation, the visible work of a person trying to determine how much of what was being laid out she could still manage, reframe, contain. It's not as simple as what she's describing, Natalie said, her voice steady in a way that struck me, even in the moment, as deeply wrong given what we were discussing. Diane's looking at a handful of data points and building a story around them. A hotel reservation under your husband's name isn't a data point, Natalie, Diane said, her voice flat, controlled. It's a fact. I'm not saying nothing happened, Natalie said quickly, and I watched her shift, in real time, from outright minimization toward something more careful, more contained. I'm saying the full picture is more complicated than a single hotel charge. I felt something in my chest, hearing that phrase, more complicated, twist into a shape I didn't yet have words for. I was sitting in my own living room, watching my wife of 9 years calmly negotiate the terms of her own confession in front of a woman who just upended both our households in a single conversation, and some part of me, the part that had spent an entire happy year believing none of this was possible, simply hadn't caught up yet to what was actually happening in front of me. Natalie, I said. Is it true? Just tell me if it's true. She looked at me for a long moment, and I watched something behind her eyes finally, reluctantly, concede that the careful management she'd been attempting wasn't going to hold against both Diane's evidence and my direct question sitting in the room together. Yes, she said, quietly. It's true. I want to tell you something honest about what happened in the days immediately following Diane's visit, because it wasn't the methodical, evidence-gathering process you might expect from a husband who just learned this kind of news. I didn't need to gather proof. Diane had arrived with proof already assembled, hotel statements, screenshots, a timeline built from 6 weeks of her own careful, painful investigation, all of it laid out on our coffee table that same evening with a thoroughness that left almost nothing for me to independently confirm. What I spent the following days doing, instead, was trying to absorb the actual scope of what Diane's evidence revealed, because the timeline she'd pieced together went back nearly a full year, almost exactly to the period the previous spring when Natalie's weekend showings had started increasing, the period I'd attributed entirely to a tightening housing market. I went back through our own joint financial records that weekend, with Diane's documentation as a kind of map, and found things I'd simply never thought to look for because I'd never had reason to. 3 separate hotel charges across the previous 8 months, each one falling on a weekend Natalie had told me she had a showing or an open house running long. A gym membership renewal at the Northside location that, cross-referenced against Diane's own findings about Greg's schedule, lined up suspiciously often with days Greg claimed to be at that same gym. A pattern of evening, client calls, taken in the driveway that, once I understood what I was actually looking for, suddenly read entirely differently than they had in the moment. I found, going through old text messages on our family computer's browser history, Natalie occasionally used our shared desktop for printing documents, careless in a way she'd apparently never anticipated mattering, a single saved draft email, never sent, dated almost exactly a year earlier, that read only, "I don't know what's happening to me lately. I feel like I disappeared somewhere in the last few years and I don't know how to find my way back to whoever I was before all of this." It wasn't addressed to anyone. It wasn't explicitly about Greg. But reading it, dated almost precisely to when Diane's timeline suggested things had begun, I understood I was looking at the earliest visible trace of something that had been building in Natalie long before Greg Pruitt ever entered the picture as anything more than a softball teammate's wife. I called my own brother, the only person I told in those first few days, and he asked me, gently, whether I'd had any idea at all, any sense that something was wrong, and I remember sitting with that question for a long time before answering honestly, no. Not once. Not a single moment across an entire year where my gut told me to look closer. He didn't say anything reassuring back, because there wasn't anything reassuring to say, and I think we both understood, in that silence, that the particular horror of my situation wasn't betrayal alone, it was the realization that I'd been so genuinely happy, so thoroughly unsuspecting, that an entire secret year had unfolded directly underneath a life I'd believed, completely, was exactly what it appeared to be. I confirmed, through a careful conversation with Cole's babysitter, a college student who occasionally covered evenings when both Natalie and I had commitments, that several of the extra showings Natalie had scheduled over the previous months had, according to the sitter's own memory of pickup and drop-off times, run considerably longer than any showing reasonably required, sometimes by 2 or 3 hours, a detail the sitter mentioned with complete innocence, having no idea what she was actually confirming for me. By the end of that week, I had what amounted to an independently corroborated, nearly year-long timeline, not because I'd built it through suspicion or investigation, but because Diane's initial evidence had handed me a map, and once I had the map, the rest of the confirming details simply surfaced on their own, scattered across financial records and a babysitter's casual memory and a single unsent email I never would have thought to search for if I hadn't already known, by then, exactly what I was looking for. I didn't confront Natalie again immediately with all of this additional detail. I sat with it instead, for several days, trying to understand not just what had happened but how completely I had failed to notice any of it happening, a question that, I'll be honest, occupied at least as much of my attention that week as the betrayal itself. The fuller confrontation happened 5 days after Diane's visit, on a Tuesday evening after the kids were asleep, in the same living room where the initial revelation had unfolded. I'd spent those 5 days largely silent, sleeping in the guest room, functioning enough to get Cole to school and Maddie to preschool, but otherwise existing in a kind of suspended numbness I didn't fully understand until it broke, all at once, that Tuesday night. "I need you to actually talk to me," I said, sitting across from her, the same coffee table between us where Diane's evidence had once sat. "Not the version you gave Diane and me together, where you tried to make it sound complicated. I need the real timeline. All of it." "I told you the truth," Natalie said, but her voice had a defensive edge now, the careful composure from the previous week starting to fray. "It started, really started, last spring. It wasn't some grand plan, Ben, it was just, it happened, and then it kept happening, and I don't have some clean explanation that makes it make sense. I found an email you never sent. From around the same time. About feeling like you'd disappeared. My voice was steady at first, but I felt it start to go, the careful composure I'd been holding for 5 days finally beginning to crack. Is that what this was? You feeling like you disappeared, so you just found someone else to make you feel like you existed again? It's not that simple, she said, and there it was again, that phrase, the one I was coming to understand as her reflexive first line of defense whenever the truth threatened to arrive in a shape too large for her to manage. You don't understand what it's like to feel completely taken for granted, Ben. You go to work, you come home, you're a great dad, you coach Cole's stuff, and somewhere in all of that I just became furniture. Something that ran the house. Greg made me feel like a person again instead of a function. Don't, I said, and my voice cracked fully on the word, the first real break since this had started. Don't make this about me not seeing you, when I genuinely thought we were happy. I thought we were the happy ones, Natalie. Everyone said it. I believed it completely. I know, she said quietly, and for a moment something in her face softened, something closer to actual remorse breaking through the careful management. I know you did. That's part of what made it so hard to stop. You're not even denying it was a year. No, she said. It was a year. Almost exactly a year. I felt my chest tighten, my hands beginning to shake, and I put my head down for a moment, gripping my own knees, feeling something pulled out of me that I hadn't braced for, hadn't prepared any defense against, because I'd spent 5 days numb and was only now, fully, feeling the actual size of it land. A whole year, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Cole's entire 3rd grade year. Maddie's whole last year of preschool. All of it, and I had no idea, none, not a single moment where something felt wrong. I know, Natalie said again, and I looked up to find her crying now too, though something in her tears still felt, even then, more controlled than mine, more managed, like even her grief was operating under some internal governance I couldn't access. Was it ever going to end, I asked. If Diane hadn't shown up? Were you ever going to tell me, or were you just going to keep doing this indefinitely? A long pause. I don't know, she admitted finally, and that admission, more than anything else she'd said, broke something in me completely. I think some part of me had stopped letting myself think that far ahead. I need you to leave, I said, my voice steadier now, flattened by exhaustion more than resolve. Tonight. I'll figure out what to tell the kids tomorrow, but I can't be in this house with you tonight. Ben, please, can we? Tonight, I said, and walked upstairs to check on Cole and Maddie, both sleeping soundly, entirely unaware that the architecture of their family had just permanently shifted 4 hours after they'd gone to bed believing everything was exactly as ordinary as it had been the night before. Natalie stayed at a hotel the first several nights, then moved into a short-term rental closer to her office while we worked out the early logistics. I told Cole and Maddie, a few days later, in the gentlest version of the truth either of them could hold, that Mom and Dad needed some time apart, and Cole, with the particular bluntness of 8-year-olds who've absorbed more than adults realize, asked if it was because Mom was sad a lot, and I sat with that question for a long, stunned moment before realizing my son had apparently noticed something in his mother that I, somehow, across an entire year, had not. 2 weeks after the confrontation, Natalie asked to come by and talk properly, to give me the fuller version she said she hadn't managed to get through that Tuesday night before everything had collapsed into raw emotion rather than explanation. I agreed, mostly because some part of me, even furious, even already speaking with a lawyer, needed to actually understand the shape of an entire hidden year before I could finish grieving it. We sat in the living room, and she asked if she could talk through it without me interrupting until she finished. I agreed. I need to tell you the real version, she said, because I don't think you got it that night, you got the fragments that came out before everything fell apart. It started last April, the week after my 35th birthday, which I know sounds like such a cliché, but it's the truth. You'd planned something for that weekend and work called you in for an emergency facilities thing at the school, and I spent my actual birthday evening alone, and I remember sitting in the kitchen thinking, very clearly, this is what the rest of my life looks like now. Dependable. Stable. Background. I want to be honest that I don't think that thought was fair to you, looking back, because you genuinely couldn't have predicted that emergency. But it's the thought I had, and it didn't go away. Greg and I had always been friendly, in that easy softball league way, nothing more. But about a week after my birthday, he texted, completely innocently, something about a listing he'd seen and thought I should know about for a client, and we ended up talking for almost 2 hours that night, about nothing important, just talking, and I remember hanging up feeling something I hadn't felt in years, like someone found me interesting as an actual person again, not just useful as a wife and mother. I told myself that feeling was harmless. I told myself that for weeks. The first time anything physical happened was at an open house I was running alone on a slow Sunday, and he showed up, supposedly just curious about the listing, and I let it happen, and afterward I told myself, standing in that empty house, that it was a single lapse born out of a strange, lonely season, and that it would never happen again. I believed that completely, that first time, Ben. I want you to understand I wasn't plotting some year-long deception from the very beginning. But it kept happening, and I got terrifyingly good at compartmentalizing it, coming home from an extra showing that ran 3 hours long and an hour later being completely present helping Cole with a magic trick, genuinely loving every second of being his mother, and somehow believing both versions of myself could exist side by side without either one contaminating the other. I wrote that email you found and never sent it because writing it down and not sending it felt like a kind of confession I could make to myself without actually having to face the consequences of making it to you. I was scared constantly, the entire year, every single time, checking my phone for your calls, rehearsing explanations in the car before pulling into our own driveway, becoming someone who lied with a fluency that genuinely frightened me whenever I had a quiet moment to actually look at it directly. There were nights you'd ask if I was okay, completely sincerely, and something in me wanted so badly to just tell you everything, and instead I'd say I was just tired from work, and I'd go to bed feeling sicker than almost anything I've ever felt. I don't have a version of this where I tell you I was going to stop on my own before Diane showed up. I genuinely don't know if I would have. I think some part of me had been quietly terrified of exactly this moment for months, and some smaller, more honest part of me almost felt relief, underneath all the panic, the night she stood in our doorway, because it meant I didn't have to be the one to finally make it stop. I listened to all of it without interrupting, exactly as promised, and when she finished, the living room held a long, heavy silence. I believe you, I finally said. I think it's the most honest you've been since this all started. But I don't think I can come back from this, Natalie. I spent an entire year being completely, genuinely happy, having no idea any of this was happening underneath it, and I don't think I'll ever fully trust my own read on anything again, let alone yours. That's not something I can build a marriage back on top of. She nodded, quiet, unsurprised in a way that told me some part of her had already known this was where it would end. I understand, she said. I won't fight you on it. We filed for divorce that fall. The custody arrangement came together with more difficulty than I'd hoped, given how blindsided I still felt months later, but eventually settled into a workable rhythm that kept Cole and Maddie in their same school, their same friend groups, even as everything else quietly rearranged itself around them. I heard, much later, through the diminishing remnants of our old softball league social circle, that Greg and Diane's marriage hadn't survived either, which didn't surprise me, and that Greg had eventually moved out of state for a new job, severing, finally, the last visible thread connecting any of us to that single, devastating evening on my front porch. I think about Diane sometimes, more than I expected to. I never saw her again after that initial week of fallout, but I've thought, often, about the particular courage, or maybe it wasn't courage, maybe it was just exhaustion finally exceeding her capacity for silence, it must have taken to knock on a stranger's door and detonate 2 households in a single conversation, knowing full well there was no version of that evening that wasn't going to cost her something too. The hardest truth I've had to sit with isn't really about Natalie's choices at all, it's about what my own complete lack of suspicion reveals about the limits of trust as a strategy for understanding another person. I had believed, for 9 years, that the absence of red flags meant the absence of problems, when the truth, I've come to understand, is that a genuinely happy marriage and a secretly unraveling one can sometimes look identical from the inside, especially to a partner who has never had reason to develop the habit of looking closely. The single clearest pattern, visible only in hindsight and only because Diane's evidence handed me the map to see it, was the timing of Natalie's unsent email, written almost exactly when the affair began, capturing a feeling of disappearance she never once brought to me directly, despite 9 years of what I genuinely believed was an open, communicative marriage. That gap between what she was actually feeling and what she chose to tell me is, I think, the real turning point in this story, not the first time she and Greg crossed a line, but the earlier, quieter moment when she decided that feeling invisible was something to solve privately rather than something to bring back to the person she was married to. What I've come to understand, sitting with all of this, is that trust without occasional, honest check-ins isn't actually trust, it's assumption wearing trust's clothing. I assumed Natalie was fine because she'd always seemed fine, because we'd always seemed happy, because nothing in the visible texture of our life ever asked me to look closer. I think now that even genuinely happy marriages need somebody, at some point, to ask the harder question anyway, not because something is wrong, but because asking it is what keeps something quietly going wrong in the first place from finding room to grow undisturbed for an entire year. What stays with me most, even now, isn't the affair itself, or even the year I lost without knowing it. It's the image of Diane Pruitt standing on my porch, keys gripped tight in one hand, having already done 6 weeks of her own grieving before she ever knocked, choosing total transparency over the easier, quieter path of simply ending her own marriage privately and letting mine continue in ignorance. I don't know if I'd have had that same courage, in her position. I think about that more than I expected to. I don't carry the same shock now that I carried standing in that doorway, hearing a stranger say her own name. I carry something closer to a humbled, careful awareness, that happiness, even genuine happiness, isn't the same thing as certainty, and that the people we trust most completely are still, underneath all of it, capable of carrying an entire separate life we have no access to unless they choose to show it to us, or unless, as happened to me, someone else's courage forces the door open instead. If there's a single thing worth sitting with here, it's this: don't mistake the absence of suspicion for the presence of the full truth. Sometimes the happiest looking marriages are the ones where nobody, including the person living inside it, ever thought to ask the harder question.